As the 1980s came to a close, Doctor Who's future was uncertain. The past few years had been challenging times for the show, as viewing figures continued to decline and the higher-ups at the BBC viewed the series with utter disdain. With the end of the 1980s, and as a new decade began, it was almost an unspoken secret by everyone that there was surely no way the show could survive much longer. With audiences no longer interested in a show that they, and the powers that be, considered to be woefully outdated compared to newer, glossier American imports, there was no chance that this old rickety British sci-fi series would survive into the 1990s. Could it? Season 27 of Doctor Who would have starred Sylvester McCoy as the 7th Doctor, along with Sophie Aldred as Ace and Julia Ormond as new companion Rain Cunningham. It would also see John Nathan Turner acting as producer, with Ben Aronovich as script editor. In this alternate timeline, despite the low viewing figures and disregard from the BBC higher-ups, Doctor Who was greenlit for a 27th season at the end of 1989. However, it was common knowledge to the general public that the BBC were keen to cancel the show the first chance they could get. This would be the final season for both Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred as the Doctor and Ace. Whilst McCoy would stay on until the end of the season, Aldred would be departing midway through the season, with her replacement joining on in the following story. The new companion would be Rain Cunningham, a cash burglar from a posh upper-class background from the then modern day. Cast in the role of Rain would be actress Julia Ormond, who would join the 7th Doctor for his final 2 adventures. This would also be the final year for producer John Nathan Turner, who was finally allowed to step down after 10 years. Nathan Turner would still be in charge of season 27, as well as responsible for finding and casting the 8th Doctor and finding a new script editor, after Andrew Cartmel had left the show between seasons. Although he initially considered writer Colin Brake, Nathan Turner offered the job to writer Ben Aronovich, as he wanted someone already familiar with the show's production. The last final notable change was that the TARDIS set was given a revamp after the set walls were accidentally junked in previous years. Although an early idea was to build a brand new interior, it was decided to just build new walls and keep the current Mike Kelt console prop in order to save money. Season 27 would air between the 12th of September 1990 and the 12th of December 1990. It would consist of 14 episodes across 4 stories, with 2 3-parters and 2 4-parters, and would go out weekly on Wednesday night. This story would have been set on board a Star Trek X spaceship known as the Vancouver, with Ace acting as the captain and the Doctor as the chief medical officer. The Vancouver is assigned with delivering food known as grain to the planet Safanhole. However, the ship comes under attack from insectoid aliens known as the Metatraxi. We see the Doctor, Ace and the crew try to fend off the Metatraxi as they travel to Safanhole. However, another problem emerges, as it turns out that the grain supplies have been infiltrated by a hatchling of grubs, worm-like creatures with ferocious appetites and capable of eating nearly anything they wish. Eventually, the Vancouver arrives at Safanhole, where the Doctor discovers that the planet is sentient and intelligent. The planet reveals that the group were the original inhabitants of the planet, but because they treated the planet poorly, the planet created a warrior-like Metatraxi in order to counteract the grubs and eventually drive them off the planet. However, now that the planet has had time to rebuild itself, it forgives the grubs and orders the Metatraxi to live with the grubs in peace. This story would have been set in 1960s London, where we see the Doctor and Ace working with a gangster named Sam Cunningham, an MI6 agent named Northwade, and an ice warrior named Tahesh, to retrieve a set of ancient artifacts that belong to an ice warrior warlord named Seja from the government. We also see the team working with Sam's partner Sharon Graves, an agent of MI6, who also happens to be pregnant with Sam's child. Eventually, the group are able to retrieve Seja's armor and helmet from the London dungeon, which is being passed off as exhibitions. However, during their escape vehicle is captured by a Martian spaceship and brought on board. On board the ship, Sharon begins to feel as though Seja is talking to her somehow, tempting her to put on his helmet. However, when Sharon does eventually put on his helmet, her consciousness is replaced with that of Sejua's. During this sequence, the Doctor discovers that her birth acceleration rate has been sped up, resulting in her quickly going into labour and the Doctor helping to deliver the baby. With the baby now born, the Doctor gives Ace the baby to look after before he and Sam enter the TARDIS and leave her behind. Ace believes the Doctor to have a cunning plan up his sleeve to save the day as always. However, there is more going on in this story than Ace initially suspects. It turns out that the events of this story are part of a test set up by the Time Lords. The Doctor wishes to enroll Ace in the Prydonian Academy in order for her to become a Time Lord. Throughout the story, we'd see the Doctor making mental contact with a Time Lord educator discussing Ace's future. A part of the test is that Ace must have no help from the Doctor, but he can't help but meddle. However, after being picked up by the Martian spaceship, the educator warns the Doctor that if he interferes again, the test will be abolished, so the Doctor is forced to abandon Ace and let her solve things out on her own. With Sejua resurrected, the spaceship returns to the Ice Warriors' hideout, a cold storage warehouse, where we learn about why Hesh and his fellow Ice Warriors are on Earth. It turns out that they fled from Mars as rival factions of Ice Warriors began to emerge, and that the militaristic force on Earth are the last of the quote-unquote true Ice Warriors. Sejua is disgusted by the Ice Warriors for working with the humans, even if it did result in his resurrection, as well as discovering that the humans have been using Ice Warrior technology and relics for their own purposes. With that, he pretends to make an alliance with Northwade, who's been using said Ice Warrior technology to take over the Earth, although Sejua would end his alliance much later on, as he only worked with Northwade in an attempt to retrieve some energy cells. During this part of the story, Northwade betrays Ace by locking her in the freezer. However, she is freed by a strange man named Valatin, who we know, and Ace eventually discovers, to be the Time Lord Educator, who accidentally reveals the Doctor's plans to Ace, unaware that she wasn't aware of his master plan. This angers Ace and causes her to lose all trust in him. Once again, he's tricked and manipulated her, and she is tired of it. Later on in the story, when Ace is eventually reunited with the Doctor, she refuses to listen or even trust him. With this, Ace goes rogue from her basic morals and challenges Sejua to combat. Ace ends up winning the fight, resulting in a defeat of Sejua, Sharon being returned to normal, and the Ice Warriors leaving Earth. After the fight, the Doctor goes to find Ace, but fails to find her, believing that she has been taken to Gallifrey. He makes contact with the Educator, who reveals that Ace has passed the test and has been accepted into the Academy. The story would then end with the Doctor travelling to Gallifrey to say goodbye to Ace. The two of them are able to make some amends, with Ace agreeing to give the Academy a try, before they hug and the Doctor returns to his TARDIS. This story would have been set on Earth in the then modern day of 1990. The story would begin by following a safecracker named Rain Cunningham at a posh upper class house. We see her breaking into a safe and finding the Doctor inside it, seemingly waiting for her. The Doctor then helps Rain steal the necklace and escape. However, Rain chooses to abandon the Doctor at the last moment and escape by herself. The following night, we see the Doctor and Rain reuniting in a dark alley, where we see Rain holding a bag of valuable items. Rain explains to the Doctor that she's been hired by a client to steal these items. Then, shortly afterwards, we see a figure enter the alley and approaching the duo, and to Rain's surprise, it turns out to be her father, Sam Cunningham. It turns out that the Doctor was Rain's client, who hired Rain to steal these items on behalf of Sam. We learn that these items used to belong to Sam, however he was forced to sell them due to a financial meltdown. Sam is overjoyed to see his items again, before the Doctor reveals that there is one item still missing, a Fabergé egg. The Doctor explains that the Fabergé egg is actually an alien device which is now in the hands of a private military group. He explains that, with the help from Sam and Rain, he plans to steal and recover the egg, but there will be great difficulties along the way. We then see the Doctor taking Rain to Russia, where she must pretend to be a Soviet agent. We learn that the Soviet leader, Vadim Senkin, has recently been in contact with an alien race known as the Shandos. The Shandos claim to be the rightful owners of the egg, known as a warp storm, which they lost thousands of years ago, and that it's a part of an elaborate machine. They ask Senkin to find a way to retrieve the egg in exchange for materials that will make Russia the most powerful force on Earth. The steward see Rain, with help from the Doctor and Sam, pretending to work with Senkin to infiltrate the private military in the UK and steal the warp storm. However, Rain is eventually found out and taken prisoner by Senkin. The Doctor is able to retrieve the warp stone before Senkin, however, meaning that he has a bargaining chip. Senkin makes contact with the Shandos, explaining the current situation. However, when he asks about how powerful Russia will be in the future, the Shandos reveal themselves as the real villains of the story, as they reveal that the warp storm is indeed a part of a machine that will destroy the cosmos. They then use their energy powers to attack Senkin's senses and take over his mind. We then see the Doctor successfully tracking down Rain's location to a Soviet warehouse, where he's able to rescue Rain but is captured by Senkin and his men, who, seemingly unbeknown to the Doctor, are also now possessed by Shandos. The Doctor confronts Senkin, revealing that he knew the Shandos were behind this from the very beginning, having seen the egg in the past and recognising the technology. With Rain now being held at gunpoint, the Doctor is forced to exchange the warp storm in return for Rain's safety. With the warp stone now at their disposal, the Shandos leave their host bodies as they collapse to the ground. We then cut to the Shando ship in orbit around the Earth. On the bridge, we see the captain planting the warp stone into the machine and powering it on, before announcing that their first target will be Earth. On Earth, we see the sky slowly turning orange. In the warehouse, we see Sam and Rain coming to realise that the end of the world is now. The Doctor meanwhile remains still, seemingly waiting for something. Then, cut back to the Shando ship and we see it explode in space. The Doctor explains to Rain and Sam that the warp stone was indeed a part of a weapon. However, with the warp stone being lost for thousands of years and several Shando generations later, the facts slowly got twisted. The warp stone wasn't a Shando weapon. The warp stone was a weapon against the Shandos. The story would then end back at Sam's house, with the Doctor preparing to say goodbye to Sam and Rain. However, before leaving, Rain asks the Doctor if she could come with him. Sam says it's alright with him, before the Doctor says that he'd be delighted to have her on board. Rain then runs back into the TARDIS before the Doctor tips his hat at Sam, closes the door, and the TARDIS takes off. This story sees the Doctor and Rain landing on the planet Alixion, where they find two humanoid races coexisting with each other, the Elixirs and the Acrons. We learn that the two races have had a long history of war, but now coexist peacefully with each other, even if there is still tension in the air. Through some exploration, the Doctor and Rain learn about a great Alex scientist that goes by the title of the Abbot. Curious, the Doctor decides to meet with the Abbot in his workshop, where he learns about his newest discovery, an elixir of life. Using a form of Alixion beetles, the Abbot has produced an elixir known as the Rejuvenator, which rapidly slows down the aging process and improves immunity against diseases. However, after further analysing the Abbot's beetle farm, the Doctor discovers that the Rejuvenator is produced by the beetles telepathically by consuming the mind of Acrons. Disgusted with what he's discovered, the Doctor meets with the Council of Alixion to try and shut down the Abbot's work. However, due to his lack of evidence and the Abbot being a respected citizen in their society, his claims aren't taken seriously. Needing evidence that the Abbot is dangerous, the Doctor plans to analyse a sample of the Rejuvenator to try and find traces of Acron DNA within it. The Doctor sends Rain back to the TARDIS to retrieve his scientific equipment. However, whilst waiting for Rain, the Doctor is knocked out and abducted by the Abbot's assistant, who takes him away to the Abbot's private laboratory. Waking up, the Doctor is interrogated by the Abbot, who asks about the Doctor's TARDIS. Realising that the Abbot is after the TARDIS's powers, and how dangerous he would be if he possesses them, the Doctor refuses to reveal the TARDIS's secrets. The Abbot then tries extracting the Doctor's knowledge through force in a mind battle. However, the Doctor's mind is stronger and the Abbot loses. Finally, the Abbot plans to turn the Doctor's knowledge and Time Lord DNA into a new elixir. He proceeds to connect the Doctor to one of his machines and activates it, which allows his farm of Elixion beetles to begin absorbing his mind. Meanwhile, Rain, believing the Doctor to be in danger, works with an Akron scientist named Dekrin to finish the Doctor's work and finds traces of Akron DNA within the Rejuvenator. After finding said traces and presenting the evidence to the Council agrees that the Abbot has violated the Peace Act and must be arrested. Rain and select members of the Council make their way to the Abbot's public workshop, only to find it burnt down and abandoned. However, after finding the Abbot's assistant and interrogating him, they eventually discover the location of the Abbot's private laboratory where the Doctor is being held. Eventually arriving at his laboratory, which is located in an abandoned castle, Rain and the Council members push through the Abbot's assistants and close in on the centre of the castle, where the Doctor and Abbot are located. Eventually the Council members surround the Abbot and join hands with each other. They proceed to chant a strange ritual as their eyes begin to glow. The Abbot begs for them to stop, but they proceed to continue chanting. Then, in a flash of light, the Abbot vanishes into thin air. Meanwhile, we find Rain finding the Doctor, who is still connected to the Abbot's machine, his mind still being consumed by the beetles. Rain disconnects the Doctor from the machine and the Doctor screams in pain before collapsing to the ground. Rain rushes over to the Doctor, who tells her it's coming to an end, and that he needs to get back to the TARDIS before it's too late. Rain slings the Doctor's arm over her shoulder and begins to carry him out of the Abbot's lab back to the TARDIS. Arriving at the TARDIS, the Doctor uses his remaining energy to set the ship into flight before collapsing to the ground. Rain rushes over to him, scared and confused. The Doctor tells her that he'll be going soon, but that she mustn't worry. He says that he can fix himself, but it won't be easy, and that he'll need Rain's help to get through it. Rain says that of course she'll help him, not entirely sure as to what he means by this. The Doctor breathes in heavily one final time and says, "A pity. There was so much more I was meant to do. So much more," before shutting his eyes one final time. Then suddenly a white swirl of energy begins to surround the Doctor's face. We see the thought of the Doctor's mind presented before him, as he imagines the faces of his companions, Mel, Ace, Rain. They smile at the Doctor, declaring, "Thank you, Doctor," before transitioning into the face of the next companion. Finally, the vision of Rain's face fades away, leaving us looking at nothing but the swirling energy. It engulfs the screen more and more and more, with the music and noise building and building until finally, all ends. The music stops, the noises stop, and the swirling energy dissolves into the air, revealing the face of the 8th Doctor, Richard Griffiths. The new Doctor awakens and lifts himself up from the ground. He looks over at Rain and says, "Morning, Rain. Sorry about that. Regeneration, not the easiest thing to go through." Rain asks the new Doctor who he is, to which he replies with, "Ah, now that's an interesting question. I think I'm the Doctor." Season 27, whilst not reaching the height of popularity as seen in the early 1980s, was considered enough of a success by the BBC. Although viewing figures weren't great still, they were slightly better than last year's. These figures were helped by a small boost the series gained during its broadcast, with BBC 2 beginning the first UK broadcast of Star Trek The Next Generation an hour before Doctor Who, and those viewers would switch to BBC 1 for Doctor Who after TNG concluded. With these more successful viewing figures, and seeing the potential in the new Doctor and production team, the higher-ups at the BBC ultimately greenlit Doctor Who for a new season in 1991.